I'm George Cheedy. We're on location downtown at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. This is the next Atlanta. Atlanta's Asian American community is still in grief, reeling after the mass murder of women in spas here last month. But there's been a pattern of rising racial harassment and violence that's hard to ignore, with these murders the most visible. The Asian American community here has grown and changed remarkably over the last 20 years. Let's look at how this horror might change things again. We have to talk about it on the next Atlanta. I'm George Cheedy. This is the next Atlanta. We're here at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and I am here with my friend, B.J. Pak, a partner at Alston Bird, former U.S. attorney here in Georgia, former state representative in Georgia, who is representing some of the people who were affected by the shootings at the spas a couple of weeks ago. Mr. Pak, I'm deeply grateful for your time. So I want to start with this. How would you describe bias against Asian Americans in Georgia, in Atlanta? What does that look like here?
I think it's very important to note that just because we're in Georgia, the discrimination felt by Asian Americans is not different from other cities. If you read the news about the recent incidents against acts of hate against Asian Americans, predominantly they were from cities like San Francisco and New York, surprisingly, right? We have not had those incidences until this mass killing that occurred on March 16th. And while it still remains to be seen what was the exact motive behind those actions, I think what's important is to point out that the context in which those acts occurred had a tremendous impact on the Asian American community. The Asian American community here, as you know, being a citizen of Atlanta here, that we have a very diverse community. We have large Asian American population here, particularly South Asian. We have a lot of Vietnamese Americans, Korean Americans, and Chinese Americans here. So we don't expect that type of outwardly discrimination that you might see in some other cities. But because of social media and the news, we are seeing more and more incidences of violent acts against Asian Americans or Asian people with Asian descent in cities like New York. And so it's very disturbing. In particular, it's aimed towards elderly women of Asian descent. And all of us who are first generation or second generation Americans have parents or grandparents that are of the same demographic that's being targeted. It brings a sense of unease and worry to Asian Americans here in Georgia.
So the first thing that comes to mind is what kind of social reaction and government reaction, what should society do effectively to keep this from getting worse?
Well, let's talk about kind of what I think, in my opinion, what is causing these type of acts, right? I always say that people aren't born with biases and people aren't born racist. It's really the environment and lessons that they learn from their parents or surroundings that create these type of biases and stereotypes they have in their minds. Asians, I think, are a little bit different in terms of the other minority races. And one of the things that we have to focus on is government can be part of the solution, but you really have to change people's hearts and perceptions about how they perceive Asian Americans or other people of ethnic diversity. So government could pass laws all they want, but unless we get to the bottom line of fighting the stereotypes people hold of particular races, that we're not going to see the elimination of these type of things. And one of the things that I would always point out is we're the only race or ethnic background where American policy towards a foreign counterpart, for example, China or other, North Korea or whatnot, that is imputed directly on citizens of America that look like me, for example. People don't understand, rhetoric like Wuhan virus and China virus. They're like, why is that offensive? Well, what people don't understand is that negative view of China or what they've done or they failed to do. They view that in people who look like me because I'm Asian, East Asian. So until we get to the bottom of eliminating these biases that we have when we see people of different color or backgrounds, that we're really not going to be able to solve this greater issue of bias in society.
Tell me about your personal experience with, bias growing up here in Florida, right?
Right. Well, I mean, I think all of us have experienced little things here and there, not huge things in the bigger scheme of things. I'll tell you a story. When I first got elected to the Georgia General Assembly, and I walked into the hollowed halls of the House of Representatives in there, and it was amazing, right? I was one of the first. I believe the second Asian American ever elected in history. I walked in, and there was a veteran Democratic legislator came up to me and asked me, like, "Oh, so where are you from?" And I said, "Grant County." I said, no. Wait, where are you really from, right? That's a question that I think all Asian Americans have faced multitude of times. And that's what I really wanted to point out. That really demonstrated the constant or perpetual foreignness that I think Asian Americans feel, like that projected on us. And I don't necessarily blame that person. I don't think it was coming from a bad place, but I think we have a long way to go in terms of breaking those stereotypes.
So you're representing the family of one of the victims, as I understand it. How are they?
It was very, very tough, as you can imagine. Elliot Peterson, the older brother, I represent the family of young AU, who was the person who died at the aromatherapy spa here, age 63. She raised two very strong sons. One is a military veteran, and the younger son has a PhD. He's a Morehouse man, actually, an undergrad. But the fact of the matter is, it's devastating to lose one's mother and one's parents. But in this case, I think people need to understand, culturally, Korean mothers and bonds with their sons are strong for a multitude of reasons. Not to mention, Miss Yu struggled, making ends meet here, as most American immigrants do, right? They saw how hard she worked, how selfless and giving she is. And so when they found out that their mother was one of the victims, they were just devastated. And I've seen grown men cry for a multitude of reasons. And being Asian, our parents usually tell us, you should only cry when your mother and your father dies, and that's it. And this is one of those tragic occasions where the death was so senseless, and it was potentially motivated by bias. So they were very devastated. I've been with them many times, many hours in the past 2 weeks. But my heart breaks for them, but they're strong men, and they want to bring at least some positivity out of this. And they have spoken out slowly about kind of what kind of mother she was, and on top of that, these issues. My clients are biracial. They're half Black and half Asian, and they've faced discrimination in multitude of contexts. And so I think they do lend a very unique voice, and they're strong enough now to try to do that.
I understand. You've prosecuted hate crimes before. How is the prosecution of a hate crime different than the prosecution of any other crime?
I'll break it out in two segments. One is the general kind of hate crime, the ones that you see in the usual context, and the second just for Asian Americans. Let me first start with the latter first. Hate crimes against Asian Americans are a little bit more difficult, that we don't see as many. And the reason being is, unlike some other ethnicities or groups, there's not one or two symbols that symbolize oppression against the Asian Americans. For example, we have a lot of cases like this when I was U.S. attorney. There would be, nooses hanging around in some places. We know what that means in the context of, trying to intimidate or threaten against African Americans in this country. And so that's a powerful piece of evidence that people understand. For example, in the Jewish community, obviously anti-Semitism is something that you can always look at. Any pro-Nazi propaganda and the type of racial nationalistic kind of movement you could use. For Asian Americans, there's not one that unifying kind of a threat, right? So you don't see as many of those cases. In prosecuting those, it's very important to look at the intent of the people doing those actions. Not just, a lot of the big criticism about hate crimes is that maybe are you criminalizing speech, right? But that's not true. You can't have a crime just for thinking things, and that's protected by the First Amendment. It's only when you act on those things that it becomes a crime. And so with the advent of social media and internet forums, what we're seeing that we have to exploit a lot of the online presence and things that they look at, things that's said in the past. And it takes a long time to investigate those cases because you have to go back to really figure out what type of stereotypes or negative biases that those individuals may have and what things that they have actually planned. And not so much as a spontaneous action, but so much as what's been going through their mind.
The reason I really wanted to speak with you here is because I wanted you to tell us, what can we do? Like, what does society do now? I mean, we're wrestling with this horror, like all of us, like trying to go, how do we keep this from happening again? Like, what's our role? Like the viewer's role? Like, what would you want them to do?
I think one thing that the Asian American community have done poorly in the past is we were always the silent minority, right? All the incidences of discrimination or racist comments and things like that, we were culturally kind of raised not to raise eyebrows, be quiet. There's an old saying that the loudest duck gets shot. Versus in the American adage, it's squeaky wheel gets the grease type of thing. And so now we have to kind of raise the dialogue, the things that people have gone through coming up in American society. And those of us, I think, who achieve certain level of success, or profile, whatnot, have to speak out. And in this case, and I think you understand this very well, I know you covered a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement and the civil unrest during the summer, is that people need to understand that people hold these biases because of environment, right? Asian Americans in particular in the mainstream media have not been portrayed in a very favorable light. Asian women have been portrayed as exotic or some other sexualized manner. Asian men have been desexualized, like not asexual. Not to mention Asian Americans, if they think about how they were portrayed in movies or whatnot historically, we've either been whitewashed with other non-Asian characters, or on top of that, tied very closely to a very thick accent or kung fu or some type of martial arts type of things. And we have to be very mindful of fighting those type of instances where it portrays a negative light. Now, that's not reality, and that's not reflective of the struggle that many Asian Americans have in the society. And so, as much as I like people issuing statements saying that how can we help, we're here to help you, we condemn hate, I think the bigger action is we need to support people, an environment where they can speak about some of their struggles and just be understood at the same time. I think leadership at all levels, in any kind of field, we need to see some diversity. We need to see Asian Americans, one thing that when I was a U.S. attorney, it's a pretty decently high profile position where I was in front of the camera, and they'd never seen an Asian American U.S. attorney in history of Georgia, not to mention many of the states around here. And then when I speak as law and order, they look at me differently than maybe perhaps someone who they had the stereotype of playing some other role. I can't tell you multiple times when I walked into a federal courtroom, people thought I was the case agent or a paralegal, not the actual prosecutor, right? And I hear these stories all the time, even my colleagues in LA or New York, less so in those cities, but in the South in particular, when there aren't many AAPI leaders, we have less people in leadership making decisions that may fully culturally understand what the constituency are going through. And number two, people who are able to break the stereotypes that's necessary to change people's hearts.
I have to say, I wonder to what degree it feels unfair for you. I mean, you have done a lot of amazing things over the course of your career, like the degree to which here's BJ Pak, the Korean American in the middle of a crisis in the Asian American community. People are looking to you for leadership. Because of that, that's a kind of a burden, I would think, perhaps.
We're sitting here in this beautiful building that really cements the history that City of Atlanta has on the civil rights movement, and I'm a beneficiary of that. And if you really think about it, those leaders who actually marched and walked, and like Dr. King, who sacrificed, I don't think they saw it as a burden. I think they saw it as a moral obligation to do so. And for me, I don't view that as a burden. I think I need to do that because I was very blessed with opportunities that perhaps I got lucky and I worked hard at it. But to the extent that I can provide a little bit more context and try to change people's hearts and stereotypes to further the entire Asian American community, I'm willing to do that. and do what's necessary. I think that other communities like the Black community especially and the Latino community have their own struggles that probably it's greater than maybe the AAPI have faced. But at the same time, I think the same underlying issue is important to highlight, is that the way that we have portrayed certain groups that have projected certain type of stereotypes, negative stereotypes on everybody, and not just non-minorities, but I think all of us hold those type of stereotypes. We just need to be better. We have to be cognizant and better to try to fight those biases that we may have.
Mr. Pack, I am deeply grateful for your time here. Like, this is what we needed to hear. It's a difficult moment, and I'm just honored to have you.
Well, thank you, George, and thank you for your willingness to tell this story. I think it's very, very important.
I'm George Chidi. This is The Next Atlanta. I'm at the Center for Civil and Human Rights with Pastor Stephen Kim of Reacts Ministry, which is in Sewanee. I'm grateful to have you here. I wish we were having this conversation under better circumstances.
Sure. Yeah.
It's been an extraordinary moment. First, I want you to tell me about your ministry and the church.
Yeah, so the church started as a first-generation immigrant church of Korean immigrants. And now, those first-generation adults have had kids like myself who are now growing up becoming adults ourselves. And so we're kind of a second generation of immigrants at this church. And right now, that's the predominant base of our congregation. But we're kind of looking at what it means to be a multi-ethnic body that really represents Christ's church. And so that's kind of our aim these days.
I want you to tell me about trying to bridge cultural gaps. And put that in the perspective of this rising question of bias against the Asian American community that we're seeing.
Sure. I mean, there's definitely challenges to bridging cultural gaps. We want to celebrate diversity because ethnic diversity is a beautiful thing. People's cultures, their beliefs, their foods, these are all great things. But we also want to recognize that we believe that the gospel message that Jesus came and preached is bigger than any differences that we can experience. So we want to come together in that name, and we believe that that's the church that Christ desires us to be. And especially, in what's been happening in Atlanta and just nationwide, we feel like this is a time where we can't resort to deeper tribalism. But as Asian Americans, we need to speak our voices, but also invite other members of the community to participate with us, recognizing, again, what unites us is bigger than what divides us.
What kind of bias have your congregants seen? Like, how's that? And I really want to be specific to Atlanta, to Sewanee. What happens here? Like, what are they seeing?
Sure. I think with a lot of the first generation immigrants, they own businesses throughout the city, and they experience prejudice on a daily basis. They get made fun of for not speaking the language. They get assaulted verbally and physically for just not looking like everyone else, essentially. And we even see that for the kids growing up in middle school and high school, getting made fun of because of the color of their skin or the food that they eat or their cultural values. And so from the young to the old, we're kind of seeing prejudices on a really wide spectrum.
There's a perception by some that the bias against the Asian American community isn't as severe or is easier to bear or some otherwise something that can be ignored. Like, what do you say when you hear this sentiment expressed?
I mean, I think in one sense, for first generation immigrants, they came and they needed to survive. And so they worked hard, they kept their heads low because they just wanted to provide a better life for their family. That does not mean that their struggles can be ignored. That does not mean that they don't have a voice. It doesn't mean that they're not strong, they're not powerful, and that their struggles are somehow invalid. We're trying to survive. And so now as second geners and third geners, we're saying, hey, wait a second, these struggles are real. They cannot be mitigated. They cannot be ignored. They need to be recognized by this nation, the city that we live in, and the peoples all around us.
Gwinnett County
Yeah.
and to some degree Forsyth County have been one of the center points for growth in the Asian American community
Absolutely.
around here. Tell me what that's looked like. Because your church has been there for 30 years.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so we've definitely seen a growth in Asian American families that are moving to the area. We're seeing pockets that surround our grocery stores and restaurants and that build up. Our schools are more and more Asian Americans are attending our public schools. And so we're definitely seeing an increase. And so there's kind of a thick community of Asian Americans in Gwinnett County. I think Gwinnett County as a whole is a very diverse county when it comes to multiple ethnicities.
The Asian American community, and I'm painting with a broad brush when I say that.
Sure.
And I recognize that. How are they responding in the ways that you've seen to the events of the last few weeks, both the shootings and this general increase in anti-Asian bias?
I think for many people, there's a lot of fear. Fear for our elders, our grandparents and our parents. Can they safely walk these streets? Can they go to work? Can they live decent lives without being assaulted by cowardice on a daily basis? There's a lot of anger. When we see our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunts, when we see them get assaulted, there's anger. There's genuine outcry. There's grief. There's lament. There's a full range of emotions. But at the same time, I do see a coming together with a common purpose and a common cause. And so I think that's a source of encouragement as much as there's a lot of fear, anger, and uncertainty right now.
What would you need to see in order to see this anger and fear abate? What does society have to show you in order to regain a sense of comfort?
You know, I think in one sense, on a local level, having leaders continue to speak out and bring about awareness, for the media to continue to cover and recognize that these stories are worth telling. They're important stories of members of this community that are being hurt. And so we want more and more awareness to happen. But even on a national level, you know, they've come out and condemned this type of violence, but you know, words can be cheap. Right? Words can be cheap. And so we want to see greater action. We want to see funds that are diverted for greater advocacy for Asian Americans. And so a combination of words and actions on a local level and on a national level.
Let me ask you an odd question. What's the media getting wrong as they've been talking about this, as the things that you've seen?
I think one thing that I see a lot is, it's some media coverage is like, this has just started in the COVID-19 era. Because of the pandemic, we've been seeing this anti-Asian racism and xenophobic rhetoric towards the Asian community rise. But I would argue that it's always been here. It's always existed. It's just no one shined a light on it. And I think the COVID pandemic has maybe brought it to the forefront of our attention. But it's always existed. This has existed since the 1800s. And so this isn't something new. And our people have been dealing with this for a really long time. And we're just finally getting coverage for it. And so I don't know if I think that's one thing that kind of irks me when I see media coverage these days.
How is the Korean language, because there is a really robust Korean language media in Georgia, and it's something. How are they covering it in a way that's different from what you're seeing?
The perspective's just different, right? Because they recognize the community, they understand the community, they know the stories, it's very personal to them. So their perspective is a little bit different. They're not covering it from necessarily the outside looking in, but they're on the inside, they're on the forefront of it. And it's something that for Korean media coverage probably won't be a cycle. It probably won't go away, next week or a month from now.
You're sort of alluding to this coming together, this sort of reckoning moment. What things would you want to see from within the Asian American community that show that there's a permanent change in terms of addressing these things, getting in front of them?
When we see things happen to our brothers and sisters of other ethnicities in the Black and Brown community, for us to get involved, for us to lend our voices, as many of them have been lending their voices for us to really represent the unity that we claim to have and to affect the change that we really desire to see.
You're interested in multi-ethnic churches, interesting to me, in part because I think that there really needs to be kind of a come to Jesus moment within the Black community with regard to anti-Asian bias. The person who murdered people here was white, but there's been a lot of violence in other parts of the country that have had a Black assailant. There's a bias. Black people are not immune to this. But it's super hard to talk about. And I want your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, in one part, I understand. I definitely understand, especially for members of the Black community who, this suffering it's not new news, and so I think many members of the Black community, when they see something on the news, it's, oh my God, again, it's again and again and again. And so I understand. I understand their pain to the best degree that I can, and maybe some of their hesitancies in speaking out for Asian Americans. And if they especially feel that Asian Americans haven't been speaking out for them, I totally understand. And so I can only speak from the Asian American standpoint to my brothers and sisters and say, hey, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What we've done in the past doesn't matter anymore. It's what we're gonna do now. And so whether or not our Black brothers and sisters speak out for us, we're still gonna speak out for them. That's what we need to do, because all we can do is control what we can control with our words and our actions. And so that's kind of the direction that I hope we go with.
Are there additional steps you'd want to see people take, see society take?
I think greater Asian American representation in our leadership on local government levels, state levels, and national levels. I think these things are important so that our faces are seen, our voices are heard. Being willing to take that step for greater representation, I think speaks volumes. And yeah, to me, that's a very logical next step of let's get out there. We need to see greater diversity, and even within our companies, our corporations, our public schools, greater representation, because I think that's a key proven way to make sure voices are heard and stories are known.
Pastor, you are vital right now. I'm incredibly grateful that we've been able to have you for this conversation. I think it's been helpful.
Thank you for having me. I really do appreciate it.
It's clear that the rising violence and bias against Asian Americans isn't a new thing. Only the scale and scope of it is new. We have a lot to wrestle with as a society in terms of fixing this serious problem, and we need to take it seriously. We've given you a lot to think about and some resources to use. I invite you to watch this episode again and each of the previous thought-provoking episodes of The Next Atlanta. Just log on to fox5atlanta.com, go to the shows section at the bottom of the page, and click on The Next Atlanta. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you again soon for the next episode of The Next Atlanta.